Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on ESR. My name is Hani and I'm part of the monitoring and enforcement team of the Registration Authority, taking care of the economic substance regime in ADGM. The Registration Authority is the regulatory authority appointed to monitor the ESR regime for ADGM licensed firms. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box below and we will try to cover as much as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to draw your attention that this webinar is recorded and will be published on ADGM's website for future reference. During the first part of our webinar, we will be providing an overview of the economic substance regime for those that are new and not familiar to ESR. The remainder of the webinar will provide the practical information on filing, feedback on previous submissions, best practices, and available resources to refer to. Starting by the regulations recap, many of you here will know this, but please stay with us while I briefly explain the background to those new to ESR. The economic substance regulations were introduced as part of the UAE's commitment as a member of the OECD Inclusive Framework and in response to an assessment of the UAE's tax framework by the European Union Code of Conduct Group on business taxation. The UAE introduced the economic substance regulations on 30 April 2019 by introducing Cabinet Resolution number 31 of 2019, which was replaced by Cabinet Resolution number 57 of 2020 and Ministerial Decision number 100 of 2020, collectively referred to as the regulations. These regulations are set with 4 minimum standards, which are countering harmful tax practices, preventing granting tax treaty benefits in inappropriate circumstances, country-by-country reporting, and mutual agreement procedures. We will now give you an overview of relevant activities, focusing on activities that we have received many questions on. ESR applies to licensees that carry out a relevant activity across the UAE and requires these licensees that carry these relevant activities and derived income from such activity to meet the economic substance test. This test requires licensees to perform its core income generating activities, or referred to as SIGAs, in the UAE, to be directed and managed within the UAE, to have adequate number of full-time employees, operating expenditures, physical assets in the UAE, and are able to demonstrate that they control the execution of activities that have been outsourced to third parties. Relevant activities, as defined by ESR, are banking, insurance, investment fund management, lease finance, headquarter, shipping, holding company, intellectual property, and distribution and service center businesses. We will cover what is considered to be in scope of the distribution and service center business and the shipping business activity. A distribution business includes purchasing raw materials or finished products from a foreign group company and distributing those materials or finished goods in the UAE, while service center business includes businesses that provide consultancy, administrative, payroll, and other services solely to a foreign group company. On the other hand, shipping business is only related to businesses that operate one or more ships in the international traffic for the transport of either passengers or cargo. This activity does not cover business that carry on land shipping or any other sort of kind of shipping. The activity that we have encountered the most during the review of earlier submissions was the holding company business. If a licensee holds an SPV for the purpose of acquiring and holding shares or equitable securities in other companies and only earn dividends and capital gain from its equitable interest in securities, then this business is considered to undertake a holding company business. If a business is holding movable assets, which includes sale of movable assets and earn finance lease income from that activity, it is considered to be under the finance lease business. I would also like to point out that all firms are responsible for assessing whether they undertake a relevant activity and which activity might be considered for their business. This will be covered during the upcoming slides as well. Now, what does this mean to me? All ADGM registered firms are expected to assess and determine whether they conduct a relevant activity and therefore if they are within the scope of ESR. The approach in making such a determination should consider substance over form and not just the activities which are stated on your commercial license or permissions. Due to this approach, the registration authority will not be able to confirm if a specific relevant activity is applicable to you as a licensee, and we would advise you to obtain an independent professional advice if you're still unsure. If a firm concludes that it undertakes a relevant activity, then a filing requirement is automatically triggered and further filing considerations arise. The Ministry of Finance have released an ESR dedicated portal in November 2020, and licensees that undertake a relevant activities are responsible to create an account on the MOF portal in order to submit the relevant filing on it. Once created and the filing requirements are considered, licensees have the responsibility to submit accurate notifications and reports as applicable on timely basis. We will be covering the deadlines and filing requirements in the upcoming slides. Finally, it's worth to mention that licensees are expected to respond proactively to any information request that comes from the RA or the FTA on timely basis. Now we can start covering ADGM, FTA, and the Ministry of Finance responsibilities. The UAE adopted a unique regime which includes 39 regulatory authorities in different jurisdictions, and on top of that, the FTA is the National Assessing Authority for ESR, while the MOF is considered to be the competent authority. Let's start with the registration authority at ADGM. The registration authority at ADGM is the regulatory authority responsible to identify cases of non-compliance by licensee, responsible to review and validate information submitted by licensees, whether it's on their notifications or their reports. And we are responsible to assess notifications, clear ESR reports, and have it ready for assessment by the FTA. And because of this, the RA cannot assess and confirm if a relevant activity is applicable to any certain business in order to remain independent. Which brings us to the FTA. The FTA is responsible for identifying high-risk cases for further inspections and audits. They have the responsibility of assessing ESR reports for selected cases, raising audits, responding to appeals, imposing penalties, and notifying the Ministry of Finance as the competent authority. Which finally brings us to the Ministry of Finance. The MOF have the responsibility of exchanging information with the relevant foreign competent authorities and providing an annual compliance statistic to the OECD. Now that we covered what are the relevant activities, what are your responsibilities, and what's the authority's responsibilities are, let us take a look at this flowchart that is available as a guidance on the Ministry of Finance ESR micropage. As part of your responsibility as a licensee, the first step, as we said, is to consider if your business undertakes a relevant activity. If it is concluded that the business does not undertake a relevant activity, then the ESR regulations does not apply, and there are no requirement to proceed with creating a user on the portal or submit a notification. However, if it was concluded that the business undertakes a relevant activity, then the licensee is required to file a notification and consider if the licensee is considered exempt. If the licensee is considered exempt, the licensee is required to submit a notification with all required evidence in that notification. We will be touching base on the available resources for the exemptions in the upcoming slides. Furthermore, the licensees need to consider if they earn any income from the relevant activity. If the licensees earn income, then a report is required to be submitted on the MOF portal. If there are no relevant income generated, the licensee is required to submit a notification confirming the same or the exemption status as mentioned a moment ago. Now that the firm has assessed that they undertake a relevant activity and they have assessed the filing requirements which are applicable, we will touch base on the applicable deadline for each submission, starting with notifications. Notifications must be filed within 6 months from the end of the relevant financial period, while reports must be filed within 12 months from the end of that relevant financial period. As mentioned, all submissions need to be made on the Ministry of Finance portal after creating a user. It is important to point out that we have 30 June 2021 as an upcoming deadline, which is related to businesses undertaking a relevant activity and have to submit notifications for 31 December 2020 and reports for 30 June 2020. Please note that the Registration Authority has shared an email reminder for the upcoming 30 June 2021 deadline, in addition to various social media reminders. The email reminders includes references to various resources which can be used by licensee to conclude on the applicable ESR requirements. Finally, it is important that licensee perform their obligations in order to avoid significant penalties. Late submission penalty is AED 50,000, while missing or inaccurate information penalty can start from 20,000 dirham. Which now brings us to lessons learned. We would like to share with you some of our experiences that we faced during the review of our earlier submissions, starting with the questions that we received that we believe are beneficial if we share with you. We have received a question which is related to ESR and if it's applicable to our businesses. Does ESR apply to my business? And we have initially started by saying it is a licensee responsibility to assess if ESR is applicable to them or not. The Registration Authority cannot provide an advice or confirm if ESR is applicable and which relevant activity applies to you. Another question that came was, I do not undertake a relevant activity, what do I need to file? Entities that do not undertake a relevant activity are not required to submit a notification, and the ESR regulation does not apply to them. Question number 4 that we're presenting, I am exempt and did not file a notification. Now, unfortunately, exempt licensee, as we mentioned before, are required to file a notification with sufficient supporting documents evidencing the exemption status on the MOF portal. If you are exempt, that doesn't mean you do not need to file. You still need to file a notification on the portal with enough evidence to support that exemption. Question number 5 is, I have no income from the relevant activity. I did not file a notification. Unfortunately, again, licensee with zero income are required to submit a notification on the MOF portal, stating that the licensee did not earn any income from that relevant activity. Now we can start sharing with you the common issues and mistakes that we have faced during earlier submissions. Number 6 is incorrect address. Please ensure that the address in the ESR forms matches the address as per the ADGM's online registry. If you have any change in the address, please make sure that it is communicated to ADGM. Number 7 is incorrect legal form. Please ensure that the legal form matches the legal form as per your ADGM license. Certain legal form needs to be inputted manually by choosing other under the pick list and inputting these legal forms such as private company limited by shares. Number 8 is incorrect exemptions in notifications. Please ensure that the claimed exemption is correct and is applicable to the firm. Number 9 is insufficient evidence. While reviewing the evidence submitted in notifications, report, or for exemptions, we have noted that this evidence is not accurate and sufficient. Please ensure that it's accurate and sufficient when you're submitting it with the exemptions, notifications, and reports. Number 10 is incorrect designated contact person. Ensure that the DCP is an authorized signatory as defined by the ESR regulations. Finally, the RA have sent a reminder email which includes the above. If the guidance provided by the RA are not sufficient, please consider obtaining a professional advice. I'll take the chance to thank everyone for their time, and we will start taking a look at the questions in the chat box.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for that presentation, Hani, that really informative presentation. And hopefully the lessons learned there at the end will be really useful for everyone. And that's what we want to drill down a bit more on now in this next phase of the webinar, which is a panel Q&A and discussion. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Land, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel discussion. And along with Hani joining us, we have a special guest panelist as well. We're joined by Peter Maybrey, who's the Financial Services Tax Leader for Middle East at PwC. So thank you very much for joining us, Peter.
Thank you, Tim. Pleased to be with you.
Peter, I'd like to direct the first question to you, if I may, actually, to kick off the discussion following Hani's presentation. And that is, what would you say to people, to firms, with the upcoming 30 June deadline? And they come to you saying, well, Peter, what do I need to do? What are the kinds of messages that you're saying to firms right now?
Okay, great question, Tim. 2 points I'd probably make. The first one I'd say is please don't leave it to the last moment. I think quite a few firms found last year, particularly as they came up to the 30th of December report submission deadline last year, that a lot of people were trying to submit reports through the ministry portal on the software at the last moment. And that did cause some system issues and huge pressure on the kind of software and so on. And so just to try and avoid situations like that and glitches from kind of firms' ends, don't leave it to the last minute. There's another aspect to that as well, and that's probably where you've got questions or something that arise. Certainly, I and my team as advisors, we're absolutely delighted to help. But obviously, our ability to do that at kind of 6 or 7 p.m. on the 30th of June will be much more limited than it is right now. So I'd really urge people to, try and get in well ahead of that deadline, and that'll help you resolve any issues that you've got when submitting.
Absolutely. Reach out sooner rather than later. Hani, you've already started to see a pickup in the number of inquiries coming through to us at ADGM in the Registration Authority. What's the most common kinds of questions coming through at the moment?
Thank you, Tim. I believe the main question that we always receive is going to be around relevant activities. If I do undertake a relevant activity, and which relevant activity is applicable to me. And as we've mentioned during the presentation, it is a responsibility of the licensee to assess if they do undertake a relevant activity and which relevant activity is applicable. As per the regulations, and as we've mentioned, we need to take a substance over form approach, which means we need to look at what the business is doing on a day-to-day basis and in substance, rather than just looking at the activities on the commercial license, which means substance over form. And unfortunately, since the Registration Authority is the regulatory authority endorsing and monitoring the economic substance regulations in ADGM, we would not be independent in order for us to be looking at which activity does the licensee conduct. And we need to maintain that independence. This is why we request all licensees to review the regulations, review the email reminders that we sent during June to raise awareness, which includes notification guidance, relevant activity summary, and many other guidances available for all licensees to utilize. once they actually review these guidances and they still are not sure, we usually request them to obtain an independent professional advice when it comes to relevant activities and which activity is applicable to these licensees.
Hani, can I just chip in there one extra thought of mine, as well as obviously that obligation that you've well set out of licensees to assess their own position. I'd add that it's important that licensees reassess their position. They may have looked at this last year for doing this kind of first time round. The requirements are a kind of annual and a continuous test. So the fact maybe that you didn't have a relevant activity last year might not be the same this year. And so you do need to take a look at all the facts and circumstances. And then if you fall into the rules this year in a way you didn't last year, or vice versa, you need to act accordingly. Important point.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. I wanted to emphasize that as well, because my sense from talking to people at the moment is that they're hearing, oh, there's a 30 June filing deadline, but I filed in December already. So wasn't that it? Do I have to do this again? And so now it's about reminding people or making people aware that this is actually an ongoing obligation. It's a continuous obligation that's going to be reoccurring annually. That if you conduct a relevant activity, you need to file annually, whether it's notification and or report. But I also wanted to emphasize that it's not only an ongoing annual filing obligation, but an ongoing requirement to assess what activities you conduct. As you know, also to your point, you may have decided or satisfied yourself that in the previous reporting period, you did not conduct any relevant activities, so the regime was not applicable to you. Or you may have identified that you conduct a particular relevant activity and you filed in that regard, but now for the next reporting period, maybe you've acquired IP and now you hold IP as well. You need to be mindful of the fact that if your business changes, that means you may be conducting more or less relevant activities than what you were before. And that may impact your filing obligations as well. So we're getting some questions coming through on the chat, which is fantastic. And I'll pick some of these up now and ask the panelists, my esteemed panelists here. Nicola asks, how do you evidence that you have no activity, no bank account, no income, etc., if you're an SPV, for example? So Hani, do you want to lead off on that one?
Yeah, of course. Now, obviously, thank you, Nicola, for the question. If the SPV, I can see here, is set up with no bank account, no income, and does not take any commercial activity during the reportable period that is coming up. For example, 30 June is the deadline to submit notifications and report for entities with financial year ends of 31 December 2020. Or 30 June 2020 if for reports. Now, if during that reportable period you have assessed and basically came to the conclusion that you are not taking any activity at all, commercial activity, and you have not yet started, so you do not have a bank account, you do not have any expense or income, then basically you need to conclude on that basis. The regulations does not request you to submit evidence that you do not have a bank account, or you have or how you concluded on the relevant activity, and that you do not undertake a relevant activity. Because the main question is, I don't have any bank account, I don't have any income. Did I undertake a relevant activity? And obviously, if we take the substance over form approach for that specific reportable period, then you did not undertake a commercial activity or a relevant activity under ESR. So you would not be required to submit a notification for that reportable period. However, as Peter and Tim mentioned, you will need to reassess on continuous basis if this has changed, and if in the coming or in the upcoming reportable period you will have to submit a notification, or if you undertook a relevant activity, and then the ESR regulations and filing requirements are applicable.
Hani, can I just actually add a general comment in support of the kind of specific answer that you gave there to Nicola's question? I think essentially the regime, the way I see it, is a self-assessment regime. So a licensee needs to assess their own position and then file the different notifications as they see fit on that basis. Now, all the time, there is some documentary evidence that you need to gather and sort of keep for yourself, and there's a few things that the portal actually asks you for. But one of the key pieces of documentary evidence that should always be kept, to the extent you've got them, is, for example, financial statements. And so maybe, specifically in answers to Nicola's question, I mean, if you've got no bank account, no income, it may be that you have no financial statements, or if you have financial statements, those would show zero. And that's probably the critical thing, if you've got documentary evidence to back up the position that you said, it's very important that you keep that documentary evidence and are able to show it when required, either to the FTA or to the ADGM in this case.
Yeah, absolutely right, Peter. Because we will do sample audits, and so that will be useful evidence to show us on, if we ask, why did you not file, you'll be able to demonstrate, well, I hadn't started conducting any activities, my business was dormant, so I didn't need to file. There's a lot of questions coming through about the actual method of filing, including questions like, do I file with ADGM? Do I file with the Ministry of Finance? How can I file if I'm outside the country? I'd be interested in both your perspectives. Perhaps again, Hani, if you could just lead off from the regulatory authority perspective on the actual process and method of filing, and then I'll hand over to Peter.
Definitely. Now, since I guess November, August 2020, the MOF set up the ESR portal, which is dedicated purely for the submissions, reviews, and submitting any notifications or reports on that portal. So you will need, firstly, to access the portal, create an account, and basically make sure that you have a UEE phone number, which is a requirement at the moment. A UEE phone number is obviously a way to just make sure that we get two-factor authentication, which is linked to your Microsoft in the background. So unfortunately, at the moment, it is required to have a UEE phone number for you to create a user. Now, obviously, if you are facing a problem or an issue with the technical aspect of things with creating a user, you can contact the Ministry of Finance call center, and they will happily try to assist you with creating the user, or try to find any alternative if you do not have a UEE phone number. So that's from the creation of a user perspective and where to submit, Tim.
And Hani, I was just going to add to that. I mean, our experience seeing licensees deal with this is that the system has been structured deliberately so that there is one portal, which is, as you say, Hani, is the Ministry of Finance portal, which is what you use for all submissions, both the notification and the annual filing submission. So hopefully that helps licensees. The literal answer is there is one place to go, and it's the Ministry's portal. There are some basic requirements like the UAE phone number, which you flagged, Hani. The other thing, actually, feedback that I've had from licensees is that the Ministry of Finance kind of help desk in relation to just using the portal for kind of technical problems actually has feedback we've had actually is pretty responsive, and so if there are kind of technical issues, that help desk, calling that help desk is the way to go. The only thing about the practical submission point is, I repeat my point again, about if everybody tries to do it at kind of 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. on the 30th of June for the forthcoming notification, it may be the system you'll see will run slowly, or possibly encounter some difficulties. And whilst in December last year, the ministry did actually extend the deadline, there was some, many licensees will remember there was a 1-month extension last year. I think that was because it was the first year, and obviously people were getting used to the position. I would very much doubt that any such extensions would occur, are likely to occur again. So please treat the deadlines as absolute deadlines that need to be met.
Yeah,
Thank you,
couldn't agree
Peter.
more. Yeah, it bears reminding that the fine for a late filing is 50,000 dirhams. So please don't leave it to the last minute. Peter, another question coming through, and we've got lots of questions coming through, which is fantastic. So please keep sending them through, and we'll do our best to answer them. And Peter, one of the questions coming through is from Mohammed, who asks, once you've filed, what happens next? What do I do then? Is there anything I need to do?
Okay, well, probably the important point to mention is that there are it's a two-part process, as Fanny's explained in the video. So there's first of all, there's a kind of notification, and that's the, so in relation to calendar year ended 2020, we have the notification process that is due on the 30th of June, coming up in a few days' time. And depending on your status, and Hani explained it in the video, potentially then, if you've got income from a relevant activity, for example, you will then also have to file an economic substance return by 31st of December this year in relation to 2020. So there's two things you've got to do, two submissions. That is not the end of the story, though. You need to do a couple of other things as well. Firstly, you need to make sure you've kept documentary records to support or evidence the information that you have filed in those filings. Because, as Tim, you alluded to earlier on, first of all, registration authority could come back to you and ask basic verification questions to check that the kind of sort of core information about your kind of activities and so on is correct, or if they see mismatches, they will potentially be picked up and you will be asked about those. You'll need to respond to those, and you need to respond to those on a timely basis. And then secondly, FTA actually will be putting in place an audit program in relation to the substantive elements of the regime, i.e., do you have economic substance? Do you have the right number of people? Are you, effectively controlled, within the UAE? Do you have adequate people and premises, and some of the other kind of requirements that sit within the regime? And so there will be a proper kind of audit process running around that, when licensees will be selected. And then you'll get audit questions. You'll need to respond to those, again, on a timely basis, produce the relevant evidence. And that is all needed to demonstrate that you've filed an accurate return and not an inaccurate return. And obviously, Tim mentioned there are penalties if you late file. There are also penalties for inaccurate returns. So you don't want to be in that position either. So they're probably the key things. And then the other thing that licensees need to do is obviously make sure that they're meeting the substance requirements as required in this calendar year. So we're in 2021 now. You're going to have to report that next year in 2022. Like things like holding of board meetings or different activities. If you conduct relevant activities, you've got to monitor that as well. They'd probably be the key things, I'd say, that licensees need to be worrying about.
Thanks very much, Peter. And you mentioned there something as well that I wanted to emphasize and discuss based on those practical lessons learnt from the filings that we got at the end of December and January. One of the things we found in the ADGM Registration Authority is that when Hani and the monitoring team were reviewing the filings, we're doing the verification checks that the regulatory authority does before they continue on, is that if there was an incomplete or inaccurate or unclear filing, we were promptly going back to firms saying, can you please correct this or provide clarification and so on. And in some cases, a lot of firms were just ignoring us or coming back quite slowly to our request for clarification. And as a regulatory authority, in order to make sure that we're performing or discharging our duties effectively, we're under strict time frames to perform verification checks on filings that are received from firms. And ultimately, if we ask for clarification and a firm doesn't come back to us, we will ultimately potentially have to decide whether or not that filing is deemed to be a failed filing and subject to penalties. And so it would be silly to get the filing in on time, but have missed something and then ignore us when we ask you to just clarify that simple missing piece of information, for example, and then result in a fine. So please watch out for that. Hani, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Of course. Thank you, Tim. We have also mentioned this during the presentation, where we have noticed that a lot of companies or licensees submitted a wrong legal form, which is a limited liability company. And that is obviously not correct when it comes to licensees in ADGM, because in ADGM, we do not have a limited liability company license that can be issued. So we have sent back and requested an amendment on the notification and guiding the licensees to input their respective legal form. For example, it might be a private company limited by shares or restricted scope companies or any other form. By inputting any other and then inputting all the information manually. So that is one part of inaccurate information submitted. Another one was the registered office, which was incorrect as per our online registry system. And many licensees actually updated their offices, and they have to update the registered address in our database and inform ADGM that the the registered office address has changed. Because we will be matching, the information that is submitted on the portal with the internal documentation that we have or the license, and whatever is available to us from a third party perspective. So I'll have to ask the licensees and everyone on board today to make sure that they are updating the registered office if they have actually changed it, and they are submitting it on the notification. So that's another part of the inaccurate things that we were seeing when reviewing the submissions for 31 December 2019. I think lastly, but not least, sufficient evidence, especially when it comes to exemptions. And I think we'll jump into a discussion on the exemptions later on. You need to make sure that you are submitting the correct and sufficient evidence as per the regulations, and all evidence required for exemptions, for example, is mentioned in the decision 100 and in the notification guidance, which is available on our portal and on the MOF webpage.
Thanks, Hani. Peter, would you like to? Yeah. Peter, could you expand on when you're working with clients, the kinds of documentation that they're putting together when they're claiming exempt status, and all the kinds of questions that you get around that for notifications?
Yeah, so I think certainly one of the exempt status ones actually that gives the most problems in my experience is where you have a branch, let's say here in ADGM, of a foreign parented entity that is subject to tax in the foreign jurisdiction. And there's an exemption for that being subject to tax overseas outside of UAE. And so evidencing that actually can be a little challenging because in some territories, for example, the basic documentation that you can supply is a tax residency certificate or a tax return. But for it's not always straightforward to get a residency certificate, or indeed actually the tax returns often aren't due. So we're filing the notifications now. In a few days' time. Many territories, they won't have filed tax returns yet for 2020. So in practice, what I'm seeing is licensees, maybe submitting draft returns or returns from kind of previous years. I mean, clearly, I suppose the practical answer is if it's not ready yet, you're going to be forced to do that to some extent. But what it does mean is you're going to need to, once there are final versions available, then kind of upload those and certainly keep them available because should audit arise, they're definitely going to be needed. But that's probably actually the area on the exemptions that's most challenging, is that subject to tax exemption.
Yeah, thank you. There's a number of themes coming through on the questions from the chat, which is fantastic. But just quickly, while we're still on filing and the portal, Hani, could you touch on what people can do if they make a mistake with their filing?
Of course. The portal is built in a way where it allows licensees to go in and request for an amendment. And once they request the amendment, it comes to the RA. The RA will review the request and accept it on the dashboard. Now, it's important to note that once it's accepted on the dashboard by the RA, you have 5 business days or seven days basically to reply to that request, because it came a lot of times actually, Tim, where people actually pressed it by mistake. That's the only button that they can see once they submit a notification, that they can request a request for amendment. So once they actually request for that amendment and we accept it, they have 5 business days to make sure that they resubmit. The MOF portal is built in a way where it will send an automatic notification to the registered email, which was used to submit the notification, with the deadline applicable for them to resubmit. So once we accept it, we are mentioning all the time that you have to resubmit before the deadline that has been communicated by the portal to you, and which is in line with the regulations. That's why you need to keep an eye on the dashboard in case you get a request.
Right back into it. I dropped out partway through Hani's response, so forgive me, Hani, on where we left off, but we've got a question coming through from Aisha. And Aisha asks, what happens if I forgot to file for the 2019 reportable period? Can you hear me, Hani?
I can hear you. Loud and clear.
Great. Yeah.
Let me take that question on now. If an entity did not file for the 2019, they need to really know why they didn't file. So if it's part of the question that we have encountered before during our presentation today, because they are exempt or because they are zero income, then they need to have submitted. But if they unknowingly forgot to submit, the regulations are clear. That's late. It's gonna be a missing penalty, missing notification penalty, which is going to be starting from 50,000 dirham. And then they are required to file on the portal just to make sure that they are meeting the regulations going forward.
Thanks.
Probably worth just adding, Hani, that I think the way the penalties are structured is they kind of escalate. So you know, if licensees do find themselves in the position where they've made a mistake previously, it's certainly worth correcting that mistake as soon as possible, and you know, getting the filings in for the previous period and for the new period, so that you don't kind of multiply up the penalties and sort of ratchet them up. It's never. Obviously, it's not ideal, but fast remediation will make the position better than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And Peter, we're getting a lot of questions around holding companies, and so would you mind walking everyone through how the narrow definition of a holding company works? Because there's questions around, well, what if it's a holding company but it does X, Y, and Z as well? And what if it's a holding company but it hasn't earned any income, and so on and so forth? So can you walk us through how the definition of holding company works?
Yeah, well, I think the key principle here is that for holding companies have lighter substance requirements, and therefore in order to kind of meet, as you say, that kind of narrow definition, your activities need to be kind of restricted to holding equity investments in the kind of the limited way set out. If you are doing kind of extra activities, for example, if you're doing a kind of another relevant activity at the same time, then typically that would bring you into the ambit of the whatever the other relevant activity is, and then you would be that sort of clicks you back into meeting what I call the kind of full and normal economic substance requirements. So the simple way I'd advise licensees to think about it is if you're a pure holding company, just doing holding investments and you're earning kind of dividend income from equity investments, then that's fine. You potentially get those lighter touch obligations, but anything that's wider than that, unfortunately, that's going to sweep you into the more demanding or onerous set of requirements.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Peter. And we've got a question from George, which is quite a common question that's coming through at the moment. Hani, could you touch on, and we've touched on this already, but it's a reoccurring question. So there's obviously a lot of people wondering about this. If you set up a firm during the reportable period, but it didn't actually start conducting any business in that reportable period, is it conducting a relevant activity? Could you add to that?
Correct. Of course, Tim. Now, if you have set up a company with the sole purpose of for example, holding equities in other companies, and during the reportable period, and and you have a financial year end of which ended on 31 December 2020, and you have obligations to assess if the requirements for ESR is applicable to you during that year, and to add to that, to add the point from George's question, I did not hold any assets during 2020. Do I need to submit an ESR notification? So when considering substance over form, the SPV did not really undertake a relevant activity or a holdco activity for that reportable period. So for 2020, you do not need to submit a notification because you did not undertake a relevant activity under ESR. However, as Peter has mentioned before, you need to reassess on annual basis if this position is still applicable for you for 2021. And as Tim has mentioned, there will be desktop audits in the future where we will be reviewing the companies who did not submit a notification, and in case you are picked for that desktop audit, you will need to have enough evidence to support your conclusion that you do not undertake a relevant activity. As Peter has mentioned, financial statements, management accounts internally might be required. So please make sure that you have enough sufficient evidence to back up your conclusion of not undertaking a relevant activity.
Thanks very much, Hani. And so just a sort of variation on that theme, which is another common set of questions that are coming through both on the chat and to us as well at the RA, is, well, what if my holding company, and this could apply to any relevant activity though, what if my holding company was set up in the second half of calendar year 2020 and it has a 31 December financial year end? Do I still need to file a notification by the 30th of June 2021? And we've got a lot of guidance around this already on our website. So I'm just going to plug going to the ADGM economic substance page that has a lot of guidance around economic substance and the filing requirements and filing timeframes, depending on when you're incorporated, when your financial year end is, and the economic substance regime deadline dates. But in general terms, I stress in general terms, if your company is set up in the second half of the year with the 31 December financial year end, the way that the ADGM companies regulations work is that you would have a long first financial year. And so your first financial year end would be 31 December 2021. And therefore your first economic substance filings would be due in 2022. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know, Peter, would you like to add anything to that? Do you see that coming up a lot with the firms that you're working with?
Yes, I think it's quite a common one. So I mean, I agree with what you've just described is where people newly incorporate something that's got a kind of long period of account, and that ends, as you say, in let's say at the end of 2021. Then and that's allowed under the relevant regulatory authority. Then absolutely the first notification would be June 2022, and the first filing in December 2022. Another thing actually that comes up, sort of question frequently, is if you've got like a sort of dormant company that is then sort of struck off, almost the other way around, where you've got something that is kind of disappearing in the year. If the company is kind of still in existence, I think the rules are that let's say it's earned a bit of relevant income in January, and then it goes kind of dormant and then doesn't do anything. Let's say it earns a bit of relevant income in January 2020, and then it's just been dormant ever since. You still do need to file the notification and the reports, because you earned relevant income during the reportable period in that case, given that the entity is kind of still in legal existence, even though it's dormant now, if you see what I mean. Absolutely, that's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. We're running out of time, so we're just going to take one more question. Hani, there's a question regarding if a licensee is undertaking a relevant activity without earning relevant income through the activity, are they still required to file a notification?
The short answer to this is yes. If you undertake a relevant activity, you have to submit a notification. Now, if you do not earn income from that activity, you need to mention this in the notification. The notification form is built in a way where you have the option to say, no, I do not earn income from that activity. So if you do not have income and if you are exempt, you need to submit a notification on the MWAF portal stating that you don't have any income and stating which exemption you are undertaking and attaching sufficient evidence to back up that exemption. The exemption itself does not exempt you from submitting a notification. It's more an exemption not to meet the economic substance test and submit an ES report. I'll give it back to you, Tim. Hopefully that clears the question.
And Hani, I was just going to say your great description. There's such a great point, and maybe I'll just give my take on the same thing, which is the always licensees should remember it's a kind of two-part process. The way the economic substance, if you like, kind of filings work. So sort of part one, as you've said, Hani, is if you have a kind of relevant activity of any description, then you've basically got to notify that you've got that, it may be within that notification you can say, yeah, I've got a relevant activity, but I'm either not earning any income from it, or even if I do, I'm exempt because I fall into one of the exempt categories, and that's fine. That goes in the notification. That lets ADGM or the relevant RA know that's going to happen. And then that means, as you say, if you do fall into those relief categories, then that means you don't have to meet the actual economic substance requirements themselves, or file the actual submission that's due in December. But you still have to do that notification exercise. And then everybody else, obviously, if you do earn income from your relevant activity, or if you don't have an exemption, then obviously you go through the whole process, and then you'll do the December report submission as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to now ask, starting with Peter, I'll ask if you have any final remarks to the panelists to make, to share with the audience today.
Yeah, I guess I would say I'd come back to one of the things I mentioned earlier on, and that is licensees should remember that this is a kind of a self-assessing regime. So it is under the obligation of licensees to, make use of all the kind of guidance and stuff on both ADGM's website, Ministry's website, to assess their own position and come to a conclusion, and then make the necessary filings on that basis. And that is ultimately the licensee's responsibility. Now, obviously, there is help available. In particular, all of the great information on the both ADGM's website and on Ministry's website. And if that's still presenting problematic, then obviously get professional advice from your professional advisor as well. Would be as the kind of final port of call. But ultimately, licensees have got to remember that it is their responsibility to meet the obligations ultimately.
Thank you very much, Peter. Hani, any final words?
The final words for me is, if you have any question, please make sure you send it off to economicsubstance@adgm.com, and we'll happily guide you to the available guidance anytime. Please submit the notification and make sure you assess ahead of our upcoming 30 June 2021 deadline, which is almost 8 days away. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Hani. And I think from my side, I would just echo the comments of Peter and Hani, really, which is that there's a lot of information out there. Make use of it, but get professional advice if you need it, and don't leave it to the last minute. And finally, even if you are exempt, don't think that doesn't mean that you don't need to follow notification. You still need to follow notification to avoid any penalties, just to confirm that you are exempt. I hope you found this session really useful today. We really enjoyed presenting it to you. I'd really like to thank Peter as our special guest for coming on board today to discuss this with us. Hani, thanks for your presentation. Thanks to you, the audience, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.